I don't know if you've seen or if you've heard about Dak Prescott's talking in an interview about his depression that he is experiencing during this time of COVID and his brother's death by committing suicide. Um, I hadn't seen the interview until today. I hadn't even heard what a sports talk show person, Skip Bayless, hadn't heard what he had said. I had seen some things trending around the internet about Skip Bayless. A lot of things being just basically trashing Skip Bayless. And I didn't know what it was. And so I went and YouTubed and watched the broadcast of Skip and Shannon where um, they discuss a little bit of this, uh, what Dak has said and come out in order for others to be have strength to be vulnerable, to talk and to be able to share, um, and from my perspective to also create community and not be alone when we're feeling things and we're experiencing things. There is a reality that cannot be ignored, and what compounds that, I believe, is the added feeling of I'm alone in this. I'm alone in this feeling. I'm the only one feeling this way. And sometimes just sharing and being heard, you don't have to be feeling what I'm feeling, but because we're sharing space and you're hearing me, I'm not alone. Not being alone is not about having people that are feeling and going through the exact same things. It is just about the human experience of being connected and being together. So I watched what Skip Bayless said, what Shannon talked about, and what Skip said. I watched a couple of other feedbacks of people saying things about uh, Skip responding, some tearing him down, some, I'll say, talking about his past and, this is just how Skip is. It's how he was made. It's how his rearing, his upbringing made him. And then I went and watched a 7-minute portion of the Graham Benjinger interview, and I'm going to put the links to these in this broadcast so you can go and watch them yourself. And I sat here and I tell you, I was compelled. I got some other things I need to do and need to be doing. But I was compelled to share and to say what I'm about to say because I think that it's a deeper truth to what has really taken place with Skip Bayless's statements, including his statements the next day, where he doubled down on some things and attempted to clarify some things. On September 10th, when it broadcast Skip and Shannon, this is the most dangerous thing that happened and that was said by Skip Bayless. And it was this. Shannon Sharpe starts because the question is posed to them too by their moderator. And Shannon Sharpe starts by saying, this is good for him. Suicide is something that's very personal to a family. A lot of times people try to keep that under wraps because, and Skip Bayless cuts him off and says this: now, if I get this straight, that was the most dangerous statement that he made. And here's why. We can look at everything that he says later in the video about Dak being the quarterback of the nation's team, the quarterback of the Cowboys. He's a quarterback in the NFL, what it takes. He should have done it this way. It would have been better to do it that way. We can look at all of that. But he is only able to say what he says in the way that he says it, in a comfort and a confidence that he has in saying it, because he sets himself up with this statement. Now, if I get this straight, because what is happening when Shannon Sharpe is sharing, we already know, we know what's happened. We know what's happened. Dak's interview has already taken place. His brother committed suicide back in April. You know, the pandemic's been going on since March. We already know the situation and the scenario. So sitting at that table, Skip across from Shannon, we don't have any new, there's no new information coming. We know the situation. But what Shannon is doing, he's talking about the suicide, and that is very personal to a family. And what Skip says is, now, if I get this straight, he, Dak Prescott, said he went through this period because of the pandemic in the quarantine before his brother passed away. He did say he was depressed because of, or he didn't say he was depressed because of his brother. This is what Skip is wrestling within himself, because he is separating the suicide from the COVID. He's separating the suicide that Dak even says, and Tad, is his other brother, even says that this brother was with their mother. And so the toil on him, the emotion on him being with their mother as she's dying of cancer, Skip is separating the trauma of suicide on top of the trauma of this man who has witnessed his mother die from COVID and a quarantine in a pandemic and being isolated, so that he can attack what Dak Prescott has said and what Dak Prescott has done in revealing this vulnerability, and in his own mind say, I'm only attacking his COVID depression because Dak says he was dealing with depression in early COVID. But I went and listened to the interview. And what Dak says by his own words were, he was experiencing this depression and these feelings. He just didn't even know what was going on. He couldn't sleep. He just had nights of no sleep. And then he said he had the best night of sleep he'd had in all of 2020. And on that night, he's resting, getting great sleep. He misses phone calls from his brother, who's calling to try to tell him about his brother who has just committed suicide. And when he wakes up and he receives the phone call, he says, I wake up out of the best sleep to the worst news. And now in September, he talks about his depression that is not just related. Yes, he makes reference to this depression that he was wrestling with, couldn't sleep with, that he didn't, what depression, whatever it was, before his brother passes. But now there's a commingling. His brother is now died tragically, and he's coming into the summer. The quarantine is going on even longer. Football hasn't started. It's not the same. And he begins to talk about he just can't get back to things. He can't work out. This is not just COVID-related depression. He had depression and whatever he wants to, however he detailed it, because part of it he said he didn't even know what it was. He had things going on before his brother died. But then his brother committed suicide, and now he has that he's still wrestling with, and the grief of his brother. That is what he's talking about in this interview. And Skip Bayless intentionally bifurcated the situations because he did not want to see Dak Prescott as someone who was grieving, in a depression, in a sadness, in a heaviness related to his brother's dying, because he would not have been able to attack him with his own comfort and confidence. It's still insensitive what he did, but it's dehumanizing. If he attacks him just for COVID, but his intentionality of separating his grief of his brother and his emotions of COVID, he's dehumanizing him so that he can attack him. Lastly, I'll say this. There's a third video, which I'll put in the links. I don't know Skip Bayless, so I haven't had a conversation with him. He did say in his own comments, he talked about his own childhood. He talked about it being rough. He talked about that. And there's another video where someone says some other details about he, actually, hits his father when he's had enough. And so it's a very, very rough. Skip talks about you just got to fight. And you got to fight, and you just got to push, and you just got to get over it, and you just got to move over it, and you got to get on top of it. And as he's saying this, and I'm listening to the other video where the commenter says that this is the commenter's word, so Skip can affirm whether he said this to his wife or not, but that the wife that he's with right now, that he told her his job comes before her. He is married to his job. He is married to the sports. He more than married to the Dallas Cowboys. And what I see as a spiritual wound care practitioner that is taking place as to why Skip Bayless chose to dehumanize Dak Prescott by separating the emotions that are going on within him so he could attack him from one perspective and not another, is because of this. Skip Bayless pushed through, over and around all of his childhood abuses, but he didn't work through them. He hasn't processed them. And he has fixated his distraction mechanism, sports, work, Dallas Cowboys. Dallas Cowboys is probably number one, because when he's done working, and if he's, not commenting on sports, which is his work, he will be fixated still on the Dallas Cowboys because it's his team. It's America's team. He, in his comments, continually doesn't talk, even from a COVID perspective. He doesn't talk simply about Dak Prescott being an NFL quarterback, but several times he makes the specific comment of Dak Prescott being the quarterback of this team, being the quarterback of America's team, being the leader on this team and that you can't lead this team. And what is happening? Jesus. What is happening is that which Skip Bayless has put in a position to keep him distracted from himself, distracted from his childhood, the emotions of it, not the situations. It's easy for somebody to say, "Oh, I had a rough childhood." How did it feel? How did you process it? Where are you at now? He sets up sports and work and the Cowboys as a distraction mechanism from himself. And watch this. Any quarterback on any other team, you can do the dumbest stuff in the world. He'll talk about you from a work perspective, he'll talk about you from a sports comment perspective. He'll do all that. But what has happened with Dak is that which is fixated to keep him distracted from the emotional parts of life have now caused him to have to look at himself because of Dak's revealing and his vulnerability. And so Skip pushes back because the only way he can have compassion is to have an internal emotional connection with himself that he uses for outward action. But Skip does not want to internally connect to his emotional being. And so his choice is either connect to and begin to face and deal with all the things that I've been avoiding over my life, that I've been bearing and distracting myself with sports and work and Cowboys, or I have to get my distraction back in place, which I'm not going to just be the super villain. I'll just be the villain sidekick. Because the super villain would have said, regardless of whether it's his brother or whatever the situation is, he's just suck it up and move on. But the sidekick says, I'm going to move the death of his brother out of the way. And then I'm going to attack him for how he should have handled COVID better, not as a human being. Do you see this? Watch this. Not as a human being, but how Dak Prescott should have handled his depression, his anxiety better as the quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys. Period. If it was the wide receiver, didn't care. His running back, didn't care. But because the quarterback is the most central, powerful position on the team, touches the ball on 98% of the snaps of the year outside of punts and field goals, controls the team, leads the team, calls the plays. That is the center of the fixation of his distraction. He's not worried about Dak Prescott as a human being. He's worried about Dak Prescott as the role Dak Prescott plays in his distraction mechanism from his own life and his own being. Now, if I get this straight, when we are listening to somebody else's grieving journey, we can't understand it. You're not in their shoes. We can hear it. We can feel what we feel because we've heard it. We can process with them to say, is this what I'm hearing? Hearing. But a need to get it straight is about self and not about the one who's grieving. Skip Bayless's most dangerous words weren't anything he said about Dak, because while insensitive and while all of that, It was the intentional setup to bifurcate Dak Prescott's humanness of brother's death and COVID depression by saying, now, if I get this straight, this depression was related to the pandemic before his brother died, right? So that when we say yes, then he's self-confident in attacking Dak in the way that he did. And that's why even on the next day, his pseudo apology, it's not an apology, it's a doubling down, because he's not feeling within himself. He's processing all in his head and wanting to understand how he can get these external situations back in their place to keep him here and not here. Now, if I get this straight, that's the deeper truth about what Skip Bayless said and what was so dehumanizing to Dak Prescott and his person and anybody else wrestling with multiple emotional grief, depression causing situations of life. That I am not 5 people experiencing 5 different things of life differently. I am one person experiencing 5 different things of life, and all of those things are colliding within me. And for you to separate something out to attack me on it is a dehumanization. That's the deeper truth. Be blessed.